Hello, I'm Dr. Tom Cutting. Welcome to my channel, where I review films and provide a psychological analysis of the characters in the film. Today, I will be reviewing the 1991 movie, What About Bob? Thanks for joining me. Let's begin. What happens when you are approaching the peak of an accomplished career, only to find that devastating irony is at your doorstep? When the only cure for the sick is the demise and ruin of the healer? When your life's work slips through your fingertips while your family stands by and applauds? Today, we will be reviewing What About Bob? A story of achievement, hubris, and staggering levels of manipulation. Is Bob a lovable hero or a dangerous psychopath? Is Dr. Leo Marvin the egotistical shrink who gets his comeuppance, or a hardworking family man who is victimized after crossing paths with the wrong patient? These questions and more will be explored, so let's begin. Before we begin, a quick disclaimer. This is a psychological analysis of fictional characters in a film for educational purposes. This is not a diagnosis of the actors portraying these characters. Our story begins with Bob in his apartment, going through his morning routine as he recites his mantra. I feel good, I feel great, I feel wonderful. He then bids his fish Gil farewell, stating that he is off to work. We are then given the reveal that he works from home, as evidenced by him sitting down and clocking in at his desk. Remember that this movie was released in 1991, so pretend to be more surprised that Bob could be working from home. We then cut to the next scene. Bob now appears to be working up courage to leave the apartment. It is unclear how much time he has actually spent working. After asking Gil to wish him luck, Bob exits the apartment and emerges into an impossibly narrow hallway where he must turn sideways to make his way. Perhaps Bill Murray was a prolific bodybuilder in the early 90s and didn't tell anyone, but it seems unrealistic that there could be a hallway so narrow that a normal man's shoulders would not have space. Bob then retrieves a handkerchief from his pocket that he uses to unlatch and open the door to the apartment building. Again, this is presented as abnormal behavior, but would not be that unusual of a sight post-COVID. As Bob reaches the sidewalk, we see a bus pass by with Bob suddenly crawling on the ground dramatically, as if the bus somehow blew him over. In crawling on this busy sidewalk, he is surely negating all his previous efforts at avoiding germs. We are now taken to the office of Dr. Leo Marvin as he talks on the phone with his wife, informing her that his editor has told him that Good Morning America wants to interview him regarding his book. He then takes a call from a colleague, Dr. Carswell, who informs him that he is quitting his practice and leaving town. We can see that he is actively packing up his office during the phone call. Carswell tells Leo that he has a patient that he would like to refer to him. Leo asks, he's not psychotic, is he? Carswell reassures Leo that this patient, Bob Wiley, pays early and comes on time to his appointments. Carswell appeals to Leo's ego, stating that he believes Bob will benefit from Leo's brilliance, and saying, if there's anyone I know who deserves the Nobel Prize, it's you. Leo agrees to put Bob on his schedule and asks Carswell why he's quitting the business. Carswell wishes him luck and ends the call abruptly. We then see Carswell proclaiming to himself that he is finally free. That's foreshadowing. Leo then tells his secretary that if a Bob Wiley calls, to schedule him for after he returns from his vacation. Leo then learns that Bob has already called twice and is on the schedule as Leo's next appointment. Bob, repeating his mantra, enters the office building and learns that Leo's office is on the 44th floor. We then see an apparently apprehensive Bob attempt to work up the courage to get on the elevator before cutting to a scene of him taking the stairs. A winded Bob then enters Leo's waiting room. Bob is ushered into Leo's office, where introductions take place, with Bob immediately noticing Leo's pictures of his wife, son, daughter, and sister. Bob bizarrely attempts to guess their names. Leo then reveals their actual names: Faye, Sigmund, Anna, and Lily. And we learn that Bob was not even remotely close in his guesses. The appointment begins with Leo staring at Bob until Bob volunteers to start the conversation. Bob discusses his fear of germs and diseases and how he has a multitude of anxiety-related symptoms whenever he has to leave his apartment. Bob asks Leo if he has ever heard of Tourette's syndrome before yelling out a series of profanities. When asked why he is doing this, Bob reveals his strategy. If I fake it, then I don't have it. We then see Bob fake a cardiac arrest. When asked about relationships, Bob reveals that he is divorced. When asked to elaborate, Bob delivers what I find to be one of the funnier lines in the movie. There are two types of people in this world: those who like Neil Diamond and those who don't. My ex-wife loves him. Leo responds by implying that it is far more believable that his wife would have left him due to his many phobias rather than Bob having left her because she likes Neil Diamond. Bob indicates that this is a painful truth and states his belief that, with insights this good, Dr. Leo Marvin can surely help him. Bob then says, "For the first time in my life, I feel like there is hope." Leo agrees that he can help Bob and tells him that there is a groundbreaking new book that will benefit him. We are then introduced to Leo's book, Baby Steps. The book cover reveals to us that Leo has an MD, PhD. This is not unheard of in film or television. Frasier has also achieved this. Incidentally, Kelsey Grammer would have been an excellent alternative casting to Dreyfuss, though he was likely far too busy at the time in his role as Frasier. Anyway, Leo explains that the book is about setting small, reasonable goals in order to achieve success gradually. Bob enthusiastically indicates understanding of the concept and expresses optimism that it will help him while taking literal baby steps around the office. Leo then informs Bob that he is leaving on vacation until Labor Day, a time span of 1 month. Leo reassures Bob that his colleague, Dr. Harmon, will cover for him if Bob needs to talk, and that Bob can busy himself reading Baby Steps in the meantime. After Bob leaves, Leo dictates brief notes where he diagnoses Bob with multiphobic personality, acute separation anxiety, and a desperate need for family connections. He also reveals that he will be billing Bob for the copy of Baby Steps that he just gave him. Fast forward, and we see Bob back at his apartment having a crisis, crying while he watches The Brady Bunch. The contrast of Bob's affect and the cheerful intro to the show is a humorous juxtaposition. He is on the phone with Betty at the telephone exchange. Now, I did not question this when I watched the movie as a kid, but as an adult, I was a little confused by this. A telephone exchange used to be a thing way back in the day where you would call the exchange and tell them who you wanted to talk to, and they would connect you. Eventually, automatic systems were implemented, and you could simply dial the number of the specific person you were trying to reach. So this had long been the case by the early 1990s when this film was made. The exchange we see in the movie seems to be some sort of answering service that Leo is utilizing while he is on vacation. Betty informs Bob that she cannot give out Leo's number, but can let him know that Bob called. Bob convinces her to connect the call to Leo, who proceeds to set a very reasonable and professional boundary, telling Bob that if it's an emergency, then he needs to go to the emergency room. Otherwise, he will see him after Labor Day. In the next scene, Bob then apparently has shifted tactics, and we see him convincing a woman who may be a sex worker, it isn't clear, to call the exchange and claim to be Leo's sister, Lily. Betty informs an excited Leo that his sister is on the other line, only for Leo to wind up talking to Bob. Leo ends the conversation swiftly, and Bob appears to regret this stunt. We then see Bob visiting the phone exchange office in person, introducing himself as a homicide detective. He claims to be investigating the suicide of a Bob Wiley. This is a pretense for getting Leo's address, as Leo was, after all, Bob's psychiatrist. It should be noted that impersonating law enforcement is a serious felony, so we are absolutely witnessing Bob engage in antisocial behavior. Bob then learns that Leo's elusive vacation home is in Lake Winnipesaukee, New Hampshire. Betty then calls Leo to inform him that Bob has died by suicide. Leo appears somber for all of 2 seconds before brushing it off and going back to sleep, telling his wife that they ought not let it spoil their vacation. Meanwhile, Bob is making moves now that he knows Leo's location. We see him taking a medication before boarding a bus while the driver sarcastically chides him for taking his time. For some reason, she knows his name. Bob brings with him the goldfish we met at the start of the film. Fast forward, and Bob is departing the bus to the applause of the other passengers, apparently having arrived at his destination. As the bus drives off, Bob begins wandering around and simply shouting, "Dr. Leo Marvin," at the top of his lungs. It is, of course, absurd that Bob could arrive at the town and find Leo just by shouting his name. However, his tactic does work, as Leo and his family are at the nearby general store. Leo again attempts to set a boundary and instructs Bob to buy a return bus ticket and wait for Leo's call at the nearby coffee shop. The old couple that own and run the coffee shop, the Gutmans, discuss with Bob that they do not like Leo, as he obtained his vacation house by outbidding them after they had saved for years for the down payment for their dream home. The Gutmans quickly recognize the situation as an opportunity to get back at Leo and offer Bob a ride to the Marvin residence. Meanwhile, Leo is teaching his son Sigmund how to dive. Sigmund refuses, but we do learn that he has a, quote, death fixation that Leo seems annoyed with. Leo goes back into the house to call Bob at the coffee shop. As he picks up the phone, he looks to the driveway and sees Bob waving at him as the Gutmans drop him off while hurling insults at Leo. While he should be genuinely alarmed at this point, Leo presents as annoyed with the presence of Bob. Bob meets Faye and Anna. He compliments Faye's looks, and she clearly finds him charming. Leo speaks with Bob and writes a prescription. Take a vacation from your problems. Here we see the hubris of Leo, as he believes his Jedi psychotherapeutic abilities are so great as to convince Bob to return home and maintain healthy boundaries from here forward. To no one's surprise, this endeavor fails spectacularly. We skip to the next morning and see Leo nervously preparing for the Good Morning America interview and forcing his family to weigh in on his aesthetic choices for the living room. This is soon interrupted by the tolling of a bell on the porch, revealing that Bob is back again. Bob states, "I know we can't work, but let's get this friendship thing going." Bob informs the Marvins that he is now on vacation and staying with the Gutmans, who have generously allowed Bob to stay with them for free. Leo appears to actually be taking the situation more seriously at this point, instructing his family to not allow Bob into the house under any circumstances. The family make it clear that they do not understand the gravity of the situation at all. Bob is told to go home. We then see Anna driving the family car into town and coming across Bob awkwardly running down the road. Anna offers Bob a ride and he accepts. He begins to open the car by using his handkerchief to grab the handle, but stops himself, asking Anna whether many strangers use the car. Upon learning that only the Marvins use the vehicle, Bob puts his handkerchief away and we never see him use it again. During the car ride, Bob and Anna discuss their insecurities, and Bob relates his telephone approach that helps him not feel overly concerned when people don't like him. Bob says, I just tell myself, Bob, this one is just out of order. Try back later. Importantly, this reveals to us that Bob has very little rejection sensitivity, a notion supported throughout the rest of the film. Anna then invites Bob to go sailing on the lake with her and her friend group. In the next scene, we see Leo again attempting to teach Sigmund to dive, holding the back of his shirt and having him lean out over the water. A boat then comes by, and we see Bob tied to the mast and shouting to Dr. Marvin, I'm sailing! A surprised Leo proceeds to drop Sigmund in the lake. As the sailboat reaches the dock, an angry Leo is waiting for Anna, while Bob, still tied to the mast, excitedly informs Leo that he has successfully sailed. Leo walks off with Anna and reveals a wildly obnoxious puppetry system of some kind that he uses for important family conversations. This is really funny when you realize that they had to make a little Richard Dreyfuss puppet just for this scene. I don't usually care at all about movie props, but I could die a happy man with the original Leo Marvin puppet on my bookshelf. During the puppet-facilitated dialogue, Anna reveals that she thinks Bob is fun. Back home, Leo reveals to Faye that he feels like a failure because Anna doesn't like him, but likes Bob and finds him to be fun. Meanwhile, Bob has once again walked to the Marvin residence and is down at the dock with Sigmund. Bob inadvertently, or maybe not, teaches Sigmund how to dive by asking Sigmund to teach him. The rest of the family, including Leo, look on as Bob lets go of Sigmund's shirt and he successfully dives for the first time. While Anna and Faye are excited for Sigmund, a usurped Leo runs down to the dock in feigned concern for his son, intentionally pushing Bob into the lake during the process. This only solicits more sympathy and alignment with Bob from the rest of the family. Leo apologizes to his family, and we then hear the title of the film for the first time when Faye prompts Leo to apologize to Bob. What? While Leo notes with frustration that Bob is a patient and needs to leave, the family demands that Bob be invited to stay for dinner. Leo apparently has no choice in the matter and reluctantly agrees. Later at dinner, the family dotes on Bob while he makes hilariously over-the-top sounds of food enjoyment.
Will you stop that, please?
An annoyed Leo gets up and walks into the kitchen, only to begin choking. The family reacts with alarm while Bob calmly declares that he knows exactly what to do. We then see Bob begin administering a poorly executed Heimlich maneuver that quickly devolves into Bob repeatedly slamming Leo in the back with his knee. This unorthodox approach does work and Leo begins breathing again. Rather than attending to Leo, the family members gather around Bob as the hero of the moment. We jump to a bit later in the evening and Leo sits in the living room while Bob and the family do the dishes while singing and generally having way too much fun. Leo reminds everyone that the big Good Morning America interview is tomorrow morning and that Bob should probably be leaving. Faye responds that Bob cannot walk home in the rain. Leo responds by saying he will drive Bob home, only for Anna to reveal that the family car was left at the marina because Leo had insisted that they walk home while having their puppet discussion. Leo elects to stay up until 1 a.m. watching to see if the rain will let up. Bob and the rest of the family wait in the living room. Faye suggests that Bob can spend the night and sleep in the spare bed in Sigmund's room. Of course, Leo is not okay with this, but Faye manipulates him by reminding him of his insecurities as a parent and suggesting that this is an opportunity for him to demonstrate to his children how cool he really is. This appeal to his ego is naturally effective, and he acquiesces. So Bob spends the night in Leo's son's room, wearing Leo's pajamas. Let's take a minute to notice how far Bob has moved the goalposts here. Leo only met Bob a few days ago, and already things have gone from Leo telling Bob that he won't take his calls while he's on vacation to Bob sleeping in his son's room. As a quick aside, why couldn't Bob at least sleep on the couch? This would be a very strange and troubling arrangement with a long-standing family friend, to say nothing of a patient who has recently faked his own death and impersonated a homicide detective. Meanwhile, Leo is brushing his teeth with his finger because Bob took his toothbrush. He is attempting again to explain to Faye why it is not appropriate for Bob to be staying at their house. He emphasizes that Bob faked suicide as part of his escalating pattern of manipulation. Faye dismisses this as a cry for help. Meanwhile, Sigmund is discussing his ongoing existential crisis with Bob, noting the futility of life given that we all inevitably die, and determining that it makes no difference when it happens. Incidentally, challenging this conclusion is the way out of this particular flavor of existential despair, as it allows one to visualize a long, fulfilling life that leaves them satisfied at the end, much like a good meal. In any event, Bob shows a lack of emotional fragility here as he reacts from the perspective of an adult on sure existential footing and offers Sigmund a distraction by introducing him to Tourette's syndrome. Soon, Leo and Faye enter the room to find Bob and Sigmund jumping on the beds and gleefully shouting profanities at each other. Faye downplays this to Leo, saying, "It's just kids being kids." Bob offers Leo Valium, a dig that Leo is too uptight and not as relaxed and fun as his own patient. The next morning, Leo tries to wake Bob, who pretends to be asleep until the alarm goes off. Leo, who's probably had around 4 hours of sleep, angrily ushers Bob out the door right as the film crew for Good Morning America arrives. An anxious Leo invites them in and bumbles family introductions, actually forgetting his son's name only to be reminded by Bob, who reveals that he has lingered on the porch. In trying to dismiss the presence of Bob, a nervous Leo makes the mistake of saying, "That's just a patient who lives up the road." The interviewer immediately decides that Bob will be participating in the interview, and Leo is not able to put his foot down with his family or with the Good Morning America crew, so he instead pulls Bob aside and privately asks him to make up an excuse to leave. Again, we see Leo overestimating his abilities of persuasion while continuing to drastically underestimate Bob. Bob naturally scuttles the plan by telling the film crew, "Sorry, I can't. Dr. Marvin doesn't want me in the interview," knowing full well that Leo will have to refute this and invite him to join the interview because he does not want to be perceived as callous and uncaring towards a patient. The interview begins, and Bob immediately sabotages it with an episode of fake vomiting, knowing it will throw off Leo. Leo then begins his elevator pitch of the book, rattling off canned remarks in an anxious and rushed manner. This leads the interviewer to query Bob as to his thoughts about the book. Bob gives a gushing, over-the-top review of the book while revealing that Leo had let him sleep in his jammies and use his toothbrush. Leo then calls Bob Boob. Bob responds by saying that Leo can call him Boob if he wants to. Bob then introduces the family and claims them as his own, then proceeds to steal Leo's seat and take over the rest of the interview. Bob appears completely comfortable in dialogue with the interviewer while he makes ridiculous comparisons of Leo to historical figures such as Albert Schweitzer and Mother Teresa. We then see the Gutmans watching at home and high-fiving each other while they cheer on Bob. They see what Bob has done and revel in vicarious vindictiveness. Bob reveals his plan to stay until Labor Day. Leo finally throws Bob out while proclaiming that Bob has ruined his life and his career. Bob sits outside with the family and tells them that Leo is too above them all in his brilliance for them to be able to understand him. Bob is talking here about Leo the way that Leo sees himself. Leo feigns calmness and an apology, asking Bob to go on a car ride with him to clear the air. This is, of course, a ruse, as Leo proceeds to drive him to a psychiatric hospital that is conveniently located nearby in this small vacation town. As Bob is taken away by hospital staff, Leo informs a colleague that he is admitting him on a 24-hour psychiatric hold. Leo leaves the hospital thinking that he has rid himself of Bob, though he is once again overestimating the weight of his own clinical say-so while continuing to underestimate Bob. He arrives home to a phone call from his colleague at the hospital informing him that they won't be keeping Bob. As he tears out of the driveway, Faye once again gives us the title of the film as she repeatedly yells, "What about Bob? What about Bob?" We then see that Bob has completely charmed everyone at the hospital and has the staff eating out of his hand. While Bob holds court with the staff, Leo talks to his colleague, who informs him that she is giving him back his admitting form to save him any embarrassment. Here, Leo explicitly reveals that he sees Bob for who he is at this point, telling his colleague that she is being duped by a textbook narcissist and brilliant sociopath. She responds with skepticism that Bob could be brilliant enough to dupe the entire staff at the hospital. She then tells Leo that if he wants to be rid of Bob, he should just tell him that he will no longer see him as a patient, and that he shouldn't have let Bob sleep at his home in his pajamas if he doesn't want him around. She then suggests that he check into the hospital voluntarily for a few days to, quote, get a handle on things, further positioning Bob as being more sane and reasonable than Leo. Leo throws Bob out of the car and speeds off, getting pulled over soon after. As he's being issued a speeding citation, a car slowly passes, revealing that Bob has already gotten a ride. Bob leans out and asks the police officer to make sure Leo is home in time for dinner. Leo's misfortune escalates with a flat tire and a mud shower from a passing motorist. We then skip ahead to a muddy Leo entering a dark house after walking the rest of the way home. We hear the voice of Faye informing Leo that the family is in the backyard. Leo then walks out onto the back deck and is greeted by a massive surprise birthday party. Leo is illuminated when he comes down the stairs, and his family and guests notice that he is disheveled and covered in mud. Leo brushes this off with, "I just had some car trouble." Faye then reveals the big surprise. His sister Lily is flown in from Chicago. Leo briefly lights up with joy, only to then see Bob enthusiastically put his arm around Lily. Leo becomes instantly enveloped in rage and tackles Bob, causing the two of them to roll into the crowd of guests and knock over the cake. Cut to the next scene, and we see a concerned Faye telling a doctor, "I've never seen him like this." The doctor reassures her that the sedative he just gave Leo has likely taken effect and that Leo is probably now sleeping. As they leave the room, we see that Leo is definitely not asleep and appears to be plotting his next move. In the hallway, the doctor tells Faye, Lily, and Bob that he is writing Leo a prescription for Prozac. Bob then eloquently and convincingly questions this, diagnoses Leo as manic, and suggests Librium instead. The Librium, as it turns out, is a since discontinued brand name for chlordiazepoxide, which is a benzodiazepine. Interestingly, Prozac is an SSRI, a class of medication that is counterindicated in patients with mania, as it can worsen manic symptoms. Now, is Leo manic? No, he's not. But Bob is quick to put out the suggestion, and the doctor is immediately convinced to follow Bob's recommendation. Lily asks Bob why Leo would attack him. Bob states that Leo has been under a lot of stress, but reassures her that he will stay and help out the family as long as it takes. saying that he will, quote, be the daddy. Thus continues our theme of Bob usurping Leo. We cut briefly back to Leo making his escape. Then we see Bob and the family seeing off Lily for the evening, with Bob dropping indications of his romantic interests in Lily. Meanwhile, Leo secretly exits through a window. The family sits down with Bob, and Faye informs Bob that they think it would probably be best if he wasn't here when Leo wakes up, though she and the family make it very clear that they love having him around and don't want to see him go. Bob graciously acknowledges his understanding and leaves on good terms, telling the family that he's had a wonderful vacation with them. So again, we see Bob has very low rejection sensitivity. Catching up with Leo, we see him break into the general store in search of a weapon, debating his options before settling on, quote, explosives. Meanwhile, back at the house, the family has realized that Leo is missing, and they get in the car to go find him. We then see Bob walking alone in the dark woods back to the Gutman's house, and he is beginning to get spooked. He then turns around and starts heading back to the Marvin house while calling aloud for Dr. Leo Marvin in the same manner that he had when he got off the bus. He then turns around to see Dr. Marvin pointing a shotgun at him. Bob appears happy and relieved to see Leo, who then ushers him off the road and into the trees while the rest of the family drives past in search of Leo. Leo then marches Bob through the woods at gunpoint. A not at all concerned Bob asks where they're going, and Leo states, "This is death therapy, a guaranteed cure." Bob reacts positively to this. Leo then starts tying Bob to a chair. As he does this, Bob reveals that he has previously had 6 psychotherapists and that he wasn't ready to change when he was working with them. But now that he has found Leo, he is ready. Leo reveals that the difference between himself and Bob's previous providers is that he is going to kill him. We then see Leo hanging 2 bags of explosives from Bob while revealing that it is 20 pounds of black powder. Leo tells Bob that killing him is the only way to make Bob go away, and that if he doesn't, Bob will show up again and continue to make everyone think that Bob is wonderful and Leo is a schmuck. Leo says, "I'm not a schmuck, Bob, and I'm not going to let you breeze into town and take my family away from me just because you're crazy enough to be fun." Leo then starts a timer for the explosives and scurries away. Bob talks aloud to Leo, assuming he is listening, and reveals that he continues to not take his situation seriously, stating his conclusion that Leo is symbolically telling him that if he does not untie his emotional knots, he will explode. While Leo dances on his dock in the moonlight, we see that Bob has untied himself and is running back to the house, still wearing the explosives. The family returns from their search and runs into Leo while exclaiming their relief. He tells them he is fine because Bob is gone now. Bob then emerges from the house with a birthday cake, singing that he has been cured by Leo's genius death therapy. An alarmed Leo asks Bob where he put the bags that had been placed around his neck. Bob reveals that they are in the house. Leo and Bob then turn to look at the house just in time for the entire thing to explode. The next scene reveals a catatonic Leo being visited by his family in the psychiatric hospital that we saw previously. Leo's colleague from before informs the family that he continues to be non-responsive. His family pleads for him to come out of his stupor and communicate, with Faye reassuring him that no one cares about the house and that the worst is over. Sigmund reiterates this, stating, "Yeah, Dad, how much worse can it get?" Cut to Bob and Lily at the altar amongst a packed wedding ceremony. The moment the minister pronounces them man and wife, Leo leaps to his feet and yells, "No!" Bob and his family then gather around him in joy and relief that he has emerged from his catatonic state. We are then informed by the closing credits that Bob returned to school, becoming a psychologist and writing the bestseller Death Therapy. We also learn that Leo is suing him for the rights. Thus concludes What About Bob?
In a weird way,
What About Bob is a movie with family significance for me. My parents were big Bill Murray fans, and I grew up watching this film multiple times during my childhood. When we would watch the movie, my dad would always remark that my grandfather hated the film and that he would never watch it a second time. My grandfather, as it happens, was a psychiatrist. As a child, I didn't understand why my grandfather didn't like this hilarious film. But as an adult with a career in mental health, my eyes are open in brutal clarity. At the onset of my analysis, I have some thoughts about Bob's appointment with Leo. Since this is the initial appointment, it would be what we typically refer to in mental health as an intake. Usually, these appointments last between 60 and 90 minutes and consist of structured questions about the client's symptoms, when the symptoms started, family and relationship history, and other background questions. The appointment will typically conclude with a discussion of treatment goals and recommendations. So Leo sitting down and staring at Bob until he starts rambling is not how an intake appointment would go. We also avoid seating arrangements where there is a desk between us and the client, as this creates a sense of a power differential and can make people feel as though they've been sent to the principal's office, which is the last thing we want. Leo's dictation is also extremely brief. Documentation in healthcare is far more extensive than what we see in this scene. He also diagnoses Bob with multiphobic personality, which sounds cool, but is nevertheless a non-existent condition. Concerning Leo, the low-hanging fruit here is his narcissism. Let's talk briefly about this term. There is an official diagnosis in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders called narcissistic personality disorder. Something important to understand about NPD is that the bar is actually a good bit higher than most would assume. The term narcissist gets thrown around very casually these days. Just YouTube the term, and you'll soon discover that everyone's ex or parent that they don't get along with is a narcissist. A more useful way of conceptualizing things is to use the term narcissistic traits. This is especially important when the person with the inflated ego has some very real accomplishments and successes to their name. A key element of NPD is that the sense of self-importance is exaggerated and does not correspond to actual accomplishments. As an example, imagine if I declared to you in complete earnest that I am the greatest golfer to have ever lived. This, of course, would be ridiculous and would indicate a significantly inflated sense of self-importance. Now imagine that Tiger Woods tells you he's the greatest golfer to ever live. While GOAT conversations in sports are always debatable, this would not be evidence of narcissism, as Tiger is widely considered to be one of, if not the greatest to ever play the game, and is one of the most famous athletes in history. We see more everyday examples of this as well, with professionals who perform well in their field. Successful surgeons are particularly known for this. We would all like them more if they were capable of being humble from time to time, but they did work extremely hard for a very long time and became highly skilled at something important that very few people can do. So, does Leo have NPD? No. No, he does not. There are no indications that he exaggerates his achievements and talents, that he engages in fantasies related to power and success, that he believes he is special and unique, that he has an excessive need for admiration, or that he is exploitative or envious of others. Now, does Leo have narcissistic traits? Well, does a bear do its taxes in the woods? Leo, of course, has a sense of entitlement, having the expectation that others will comply with his wishes. He also demonstrates a lack of empathy and generally presents as arrogant. So how do these traits impact things for Leo in our story? It's important to understand in life that significant overestimation of yourself, be it your looks, skills, or intelligence, is likely to cause you difficulties. There are many ways that this effect can manifest itself, but a particularly poignant example I like to use is Ted Bundy. Now, Ted was an American serial killer with 20 known victims, though he confessed to 30. When he was finally apprehended, he had to face the legal system. His public defender team successfully worked out a plea deal where he could plead guilty and avoid the death penalty. Given the heinous nature of his crimes and the fact that this was in the state of Florida, getting the death penalty off the table was a massive legal win. Or at least, it would have been. Ted rejected the deal and pleaded not guilty. At trial, he then would make attempts to sabotage his own defense team, becoming envious when his attorney would have successful moments in the courtroom. Ted ultimately fired his defense team and elected to represent himself. There's a legal saying that he who represents himself has a fool for a client. Ted would end up exemplifying this, but he could not see it that way. If you go watch the footage from his trial, you will see a man in a state of complete confidence, absolutely certain that he is too charming and convincing to lose. You will also see a scene of profound shock when he is found guilty. He appeared to have been in genuine disbelief. The takeaway here is that overestimating yourself can put you at great risk. In the case of Leo, he overestimates his skills as a psychotherapist and his ability to be interpersonally persuasive. This combined with an underestimation of Bob to create a massive blind spot for Leo. Had Leo had a more realistic view of himself and Bob, he likely would have taken the situation more seriously when Bob stalked him to his vacation home. He also would have taken the time to delineate to his family exactly why Bob showing up constituted a serious situation and why dual relationships are to be avoided by psychotherapists. Now, you may be asking, Tom, what is a dual relationship? A dual relationship occurs when there is any relationship between the therapist and client that extends beyond the already existing therapeutic relationship. Examples of this would be romantic relationships, friendships, business relationships, or other social relationships. In the case of Bob, he clearly views himself as a friend of Leo and his family, and he behaves accordingly. At no point does Leo explain to Bob why they cannot be friends, nor does he explain this to his family. Rather, he simply declares that Bob must leave because he's a patient, becoming frustrated with his family when they don't inherently understand the reasoning behind this. Now, you might also be asking yourself, Tom, what would have been the appropriate steps to take in Dr. Marvin's position? Well, I'm glad you asked that. Leo actually started out good when Bob convinced Betty at the telephone exchange to connect their call. He calmly informed Bob that he is not available while on vacation and advised him to go to the emergency room if he is having an emergency. When Bob hires a sex worker to call and pretend to be Leo's sister, Leo again reacted appropriately. It is when Bob shows up in Lake Winnipesaukee and then comes to Leo's home after previously agreeing to buy a return bus ticket that alarm should have set in. While Leo would not necessarily be aware at this point that Bob impersonated a law enforcement officer, he would immediately know by seeing an alive Bob that he had faked his own demise and had stalked him across state lines. Now, can Leo make Bob leave town and go back to New York City? No, he cannot. However, when Bob shows up at his house, he can ask him to leave, which he indeed does. In New Hampshire, Bob would be guilty of criminal trespass when he returns to the Marvin residence after being explicitly told that he is not allowed to be there. By recognizing his inability to persuade Bob to leave and the need to involve law enforcement, Leo would have been taking the appropriate steps to keep his family safe and to preserve ethical professional boundaries. However, Leo did not do this and paid with his home and his sanity. And now you may be thinking, yes, Tom, that's very interesting. But what about Bob? Listen, we're getting there. First, I will rule out something called borderline personality disorder. While at the onset, Bob appears to be engaging in frantic efforts to avoid perceived abandonment by Leo and shows some initial affective instability when he is crying while watching the Brady Bunch, there are no strong indications that borderline personality disorder describes Bob accurately. While I could dive into the weeds on this, the primary takeaway is that Bob is not rejection sensitive and seems to never get angry. If Bob had borderline personality disorder, we would see indications of an unstable self-image, difficulty controlling his anger, intense mood swings, chronic feelings of emptiness, fear and or anger at perceived rejection, an oscillation between overvalue and undervalue of others in relationships. Instead, for most of the film, we see an emotionally resilient man who gets along well with others and is just generally in a good mood most of the time. We should also address Bob's numerous anxiety symptoms. During his dictation, Leo diagnoses Bob with separation anxiety. Separation anxiety disorder is characterized by excessive distress when separated from attachment figures, worry about said attachment figures when separated from them, worry that something bad will happen to prevent them from reuniting with said attachment figures, fear of being home alone or alone in other settings, refusal or reluctance to go to school or work due to fear of separation, repeated nightmares related to separation, and the development of physical anxiety symptoms when separation is anticipated or occurs, such as nausea or vomiting. Now, I do not believe that separation anxiety disorder describes Bob's anxiety symptoms, as there is no indication that his symptoms are related to separation from an attachment figure. An attachment figure, by the way, is typically a parent or caregiver. Because of this, separation anxiety disorder is something typically seen in children, not in grown adults who live by themselves. Rather than separation anxiety, I think Bob's described symptoms more closely align with panic disorder with agoraphobia. This condition is characterized by recurrent, unexpected panic attacks, consistent worry about having another attack, an avoidance of situations where the individual believes escape might be difficult or help not available should a panic attack occur. The avoided situations typically include public transportation, public spaces such as malls and theaters, being in a crowd, or being outside of the home alone. Bob describes symptoms that are consistent with a panic attack while relating that he becomes anxious when he leaves his apartment and that he worries about something bad happening, such as his bladder exploding. We also see him avoiding elevators, a behavior that would be consistent with agoraphobia. An interesting factoid, agoraphobia contains the root word agora, which is Greek for the marketplace. So agoraphobia literally translates to fear of the marketplace. Now, all this being said, it is noteworthy that Bob gets on a bus to another state without knowing where he will stay in order to stalk Leo. It would not be typical for someone with agoraphobia who struggles to leave their apartment or get on elevators to suddenly board a bus out of state without knowing where they will stay. Now let's review an approximation of who the film wants us to see Bob as. In this view, Bob is basically like a golden retriever. Actually, I've had the thought that Bob Wiley would be a great name for a Goldie. Bob wants to be everybody's friend and will relentlessly pursue your time and attention. In this conceptualization, Bob is naive and genuine. He assumes that other people like him, especially Leo, and he acts accordingly. The problem with this view is that it requires Bob to be beyond stupid. Are we to believe that Bob cannot understand that Leo loathes him? That Leo didn't try to have him committed? That Leo didn't push him in the lake? That Leo didn't try to murder him? Sure, Bob apparently thinks that tying him to a chair with explosives is symbolic and part of therapy, but as soon as the house exploded, he would have known that Leo just tried to murder him. So what if we don't believe that Bob could be that radically dense? This brings us to who I believe Bob really is. a vindictive psychopath. Now, while psychopathy is not categorized as a disorder in the DSM, it is nevertheless a well-recognized construct in forensic psychology. Likely the most recognized model of psychopathy is that of Canadian psychologist Robert Hare, who developed a two-factor model comprising interpersonal elements and antisocial behavior. In Bob's case, we see manipulation, superficial charm, and a complete lack of remorse for his negative and felonious actions. Along with this, we see criminal behavior, impulsivity, and irresponsibility. So what do I think is going on here? I believe that this whole thing is a drastic exercise in vindictiveness subsequent to a perceived slight. Bob was personally insulted when Leo told him that he was being passed off onto another provider while he was on vacation. Furthermore, Leo refused to give Bob his phone number or tell him where he was going. In Bob's eyes, Leo did not value him enough or view him as having sufficient importance. Billing him for the book probably didn't help either. So Bob sets out to ruin Leo's career, steal his family, and rob him of his sanity. This is, of course, drastically disproportionate to the perceived slight, but that's what makes Bob a true monster. Bob proceeds to do whatever it takes to find Leo and arrive at his doorstep, charming his way into Leo's home. Not only does Bob manipulate the family into liking him more than Leo, he progressively takes steps to make Leo appear less mentally stable than him. All the incidents where Bob seems naive to Leo's disdain for him, Bob knows exactly what's going on, but he will never break character and let Leo know this because it would validate Leo's experiences. Instead, he keeps up his facade of the lovable dolt, and Leo feels more and more alone as he nears the end of his rope. This culminates in Bob exploding Leo's treasured vacation home and marrying his sister Lily, while a mentally and spiritually broken void of what was once Dr. Leo Marvin looks on helplessly. The cherry on top is that Bob then becomes a psychologist and writes a bestseller. Having stolen Leo's family, destroyed his home, and annihilated his sanity, the only thing left was to steal his career, to outshine Leo in his own field, taking everything from him and leaving him with nothing.
I drink your milkshake. I drink it up!
And so ends the story of a hardworking man who soared too close to the sun in his office on the 44th floor. Little did he know that unbridled evil had darkened his doorstep, and by the time he figured it out, it was far too late. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.